When we're talking about the fossils we found, remember we want to figure out what their climate was and their habitat was. So we have to look at plate tectonics and climate trends within the Cenozoic era because we talk about global warming now and how it's getting warmer and warmer, but that's not been a steady thing throughout history. The climate goes up and down depending on what time period we're looking at. So plate tectonics, underneath the continents, there are plates. And originally, they used to call it continental drift, the movement of the continents. But now we realize that there's these tectonic plates that move. So within the Pacific, it's where they're spreading apart. That's why we have all the volcanoes around the Pacific Ocean, and because that's where the plates are splitting apart, allowing magma to come up from underneath and become a volcano. And that forces the plates apart. And then they run into other plates. So the Pacific plate's running into the North American plate. And that's where we get all the earthquakes on the West Coast. And it's a whole field of study of its own. But the positions of the plates over geologic time have influenced the shape of the geology of our planet and the climate as well, and the distribution patterns of all living things. So if you go back far enough in time, all the continents were attached to each other. It was a supercontinent called Pangaea. And then through plate movement, it started splitting apart. So at the start of the Cenozoic era, there is a picture on page 315 that shows the position of the continents at the beginning of the Paleocene epoch, which is the oldest epoch of the Cenozoic era. And so there's a series of those pictures throughout your book, throughout this chapter. They're going to show us how the continents drifted apart from each other. During the Cenozoic era, there was a trend toward cooling and drying, but there was a lot of fluctuations over the course of the era. And the continental positions and their climate conditions influenced primate distribution. Part of it is whether the continents touched each other or not. If they touch each other, then animals can migrate back and forth, as opposed to when they drift apart and there's no longer a corridor for them to migrate through. And part of it is climate, because remember, primates prefer a tropical or subtropical environment. So if the climate cools too much, they have to move towards the equator to get to the warmer climes. So 66 million years ago, at the beginning of the Paleocene, what you see in that picture on page 315 is two continents. Laurasia, which is Europe, Asia, and North America, are all attached to each other. And Gondwanaland, which is Africa, South America, Antarctica, and Australia. At that time period, India was not attached to any of the continents. It was still an island. What that means is there were no Himalayas at this time period, because the Himalayas were created when India ran into the Asian subcontinent and caused uplift that created the Himalayan mountains. So that means that there's no mountains to affect the climate, and mountains have a great effect on climate because they do create what's called a rain shadow. So if you were to look at the climate of the Sierra Nevadas on the western side slopes versus the eastern slopes, there's a lot more rainfall on the western slopes than on the eastern slopes, because there's a rain shadow. The storms come in from the Pacific and they hit the mountains, and a lot of times most of the rain gets left on the western side of the mountains, either as rain or in the winter as snow, and very little of it gets over on the eastern side. So it's much drier on the eastern side of the Sierras because of that rain shadow. But there's no Himalayas, so we don't have that giant rain shadow in the Asian subcontinent at this time period. So the early Cenozoic right after the age of dinosaurs. It's very warm and humid, and there's very little climate difference between northern and southern latitudes. So you have from Minnesota all the way down to Argentina is pretty much all tropical rainforest. It's that warm. So you think about Minnesota now where they have very, very cold, snowy winters. No, it was just all tropical rainforest. And it was so warm that England actually was full of swamps and had alligators because it was that warm in England in this time period. So this is the climate of the planet at the time that primates first differentiate themselves from the rest of mammals. This is where we see the beginning of the evolution of primates. So when we're looking at these very early fossils, how do we distinguish whether they are a very early primate or still, you know, from our common mammalian ancestor? And we have to, so the key question is then is what are the anatomical and behavioral differences that make it be a primate? And we talked about all the differences that for the different types of primates that we have now, but when they first were evolving away from the common ancestor, what did we start seeing that let us know that these were no longer basic mammals, but were becoming primates? And where did these traits come from? So a lot of the traits are the ones we've already talked about. The forward facing eyes, the smaller snouts, things like that. And they have had to evolve theories about why did we evolve these traits that made us look different, made us be different from the other mammals. And the oldest theory for this is called the arboreal theory. Now remember, theories are they haven't been proven or disproven necessarily. It's just what one scientist or several scientists feel fits the evidence the best, as opposed to a law like the law of gravity, which is proven, and it's a law. Theories can always be disproved later through further evidence. There's always that possibility. So the oldest one is the arboreal theory. This was originally assumed that primates, their early adaptations of forward-facing eyes and grasping hands were to make them better in the trees, better adapted for arboreal living. That they had the forward-facing eyes, so they had better binocular vision to allow them to focus better, have more of a 3D vision of the world in front of them, and grasping hands to grasp onto tree branches. Then somebody else reevaluated the data, and they reevaluated these features, and they proposed instead that these features were evolved to help them nab prey in low shrubby vegetation where the earliest primates foraged. So this theory comes from looking at the environment and the habitat of the area where the earliest primates were evolving from. And then more recently, some other scientists have decided that neither one of those theories really covers the information and the facts very well. So we have an even more recent one called the primate angiosperm coevolution theory. And this is the idea. And angiosperms are plants that flower. In the era of the dinosaurs, there were no flowering plants. Plants had spores. If you think about ferns on the underside of their leaves, there's spores. That's how they produce new ferns. There were no flowering plants. And right around the same time as when primates were evolving, flowering plants started evolving. And this theory says that the forward-facing eyes and the grasping hands were allowing the primates to get to the terminal ends of branches, because flowers are always towards the ends of the branches, allowing them to get to the terminal ends of branches to be able to forage and eat the flowers, the fruit or nuts that they produced, as well as insects that were visiting the flowers. And so they kind of evolved at the same time. but nobody knows for sure. We don't have enough fossils. We don't have enough evidence to say for sure if any of these theories are the correct theory. We may never know for sure. So, primate beginnings. Paleocene epoch is 66 to 56 million years ago. So, from the fall of the dinosaurs for for 10 million years. Primates were a very early branching from the mammalian tree. We were one of the first, evolutionary branches away from the basic mammalian pattern. Some of the possible, because at this time period, we have fossils that we think were early primates, but there's not enough differences and there's not enough primate traits to say yes for sure or no for sure. So some of the first possible primates were the Plesiadapiforms, and they had certain primate-like characteristics. Some Plesiadapiforms had more primate-like traits than others. They had the petrosal bulla, which remember is the bony middle ear, the floor of the middle ear that's formed from the petrosal area of the temporal bone. They have more rounded molar cusps. So remember that the very early mammals at the end of the age of dinosaurs were mostly insectivores who would have had sharp pointed cusps. These guys are starting to have more lower, more rounded cusps, indicating that they have a more varied diet than just insects. And they had more or less arboreal postcranial features. So the Plesiadapiforms are found in North America and Europe and China. There's a fairly large number. They have about 75 different species, and they range in size from a mouse to a small house cat. So, from about that big to about that big. That's the size of the Plesiadapiforms. And some of them are Purgatorius, Plesiadapis, and Carpolestes are some of the names. You don't have to memorize the names. Know where they exist in your book in case they turn up on a test, but I'm not going to make you memorize these names, okay? So some of the Plesiadapiforms were very successful, and they lasted throughout the entire Paleocene and through a good chunk of the Eocene, okay, before becoming extinct. And they think that they became extinct because they were outcompeted by rodents. Rodents are very competitive. They're the most common mammal on the planet because they are so successful. So then we get to the Eocene epoch, which is 56 to 34 million years ago. And this is where we find the first true primates, where we're seeing enough traits that we can say, yes, these are primate ancestors, not just mammalian. So the main tectonic event of this time period is the separation of North America from Europe. So the Eurasian supercontinent is starting to break apart. And so no longer can animals migrate from Europe to North America back and forth because they're splitting apart. And during this epoch, because of the way everything is moving around in terms of the continents, we see a severe drop in temperature. So it's going to get cooler. At the beginning of the Eocene, there are primates present in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So they're pretty, widespread. The two best known and best represented groups in the fossil record are in North America and Europe. So when we think of primates, we usually think of Africa and Asia for the bulk of primates. But in this time period, that's not where the bulk of them are being found. They're being found in Europe and in North America and Europe. So we have the Adipoidea and the Omomyoidea. At this time, these are called true primates because all the main primate features are present in these guys. So they're definitely primates now. The Adipoidea are considered probable ancestors to the strepsirrhines. They don't have enough sequential fossils to say for sure, but they feel this is a possible strepsirrhine ancestor. There's over 80 different species represented in the fossil record, and they're getting a little bit bigger. So these guys range in size from a large rat, so probably about this big, to a large house cat, so bigger than I can show on the screen. And they're found in North America and Europe. And there's also some species found in Asia and Africa. of the Adipoidea. Then we have the Omomyoids, which are possible haplorine ancestors. But this theory is now contested. So it kind of depends on who you're following, whether you still feel these are ancestors to the haplorines or not. The Omomyoids are smaller than the Adipoids, very similar in appearance to tarsiers, and they had more than 90 species, and they're small-bodied like the tarsiers. They're much smaller than the Adipoids. And had names such as Necrolemur and Titonius. And these names are in your book, and they say which continent they're found in. And then in Africa and Asia, the fossils that they're finding there are quite different and distinct from the Adipoidea and Omomyoidea. So in China, you have Eosimius, which appears to have features representative of the anthropoids before they diverged into platyrines and catarrhines. And Archicebus, which is also from China, which may have been very close to to the time period of the divergence of tarsiers from the anthropoids. And this is one of the oldest, most complete true primates found. And there is a picture of one on figure 12.8 in your book, which is on page 317. There's a drawing of a Archicebus. And then in Africa, towards the very end of the Eocene, they have one called the Catopithecus. At this point, by the time we get to the end of the Eocene, this is clearly an anthropoid with catarrhine features. So we're starting to really see them starting to split off get the features for the different groups that we talked about for the living primates. Then we get to the Oligocene. This is 34 to 23 million years ago. The Oligocene is a time period with a lot of volcanic and tectonic activity. Everything's moving around, lots of stuff going on. During this epoch, Africa and Europe moved closer together to each other to form the Mediterranean Sea. India begins pushing into Asia, so the Himalayas are starting to rise up. Australia and South America have finally separated from Antarctica, and Antarctica is now drifting towards, the far south. So anything living on Antarctica, their time is numbered. So this towards the end of the Eocene, right before the Oligocene, is when we see this extreme drop in temperature. And this makes the beginning of the Oligocene, the northern hemisphere is very inhospitable to primates. It's just not warm and humid enough for them. So they either migrate south towards the they either went extinct or migrated south. Okay, because it's too cold for them to be up in Europe and places like that. So the fossil record during the Oligocene is very sparse, just because of the way the world was and everything, all the tectonic activity. There's just not a lot of fossils got produced. And there's the only exception to that is this area of Egypt called the Fayum Depression. The Fayum Depression, think about Egypt. It's a very dry desert environment now, but during this time period, it was a lush riverine forest area. And they had two fossil primate families. Pretty much the only primate fossils found for the Oligocene are found in the Fayum Depression of Egypt. One is the Parapithecidae, of which Opidium was found around 36 million years ago. And this is starting to show similarities to New World monkeys, even though it's in Egypt. So it doesn't have a bony ear tube. It has the 2133 dental formula. So they think that this might be ancestral to the platyrines, that then they migrated into South America before it split off from Africa. And then you have the Propleopithecidae, of which Egyptopithecus is the best known one. This is from 33 million years ago and was likely a very early catarrhine. So it's already got the 2123 dental formula. and its teeth are comparable to that seen in hominids. This is the first time the Egyptopithecus is the first time in the fossil record where we see that Y5 molar pattern that all the great apes and humans have. And the old world monkeys at this time period before would still have had a Y5 molar pattern. The Bilophodonti that you see in the extant old world monkeys is something that they evolved at a later time period after splitting off from the rest of the Catarines. So this is the first time we see that Y5 molar pattern. So this is considered to be a common ancestor for both the Cercopithecoid and hominoid lines. We don't know if it's the last common ancestor, but it's considered to be a common ancestor to the two lines. Then your book comes up with a couple of more recent finds, which have really hard to pronounce names. So there's Nsunguipithecus gunelli, which is possibly the oldest of the old world monkeys, and Rheucopithecus flegeli, which is the earliest known hominoid. And the Rheucopithecus dates to just over 25 million years ago. And what makes this really important is that before they found this fossil, they had been doing molecular data studies. And the analysis of the molecular data that they had done predicted the split between the old world monkeys and the hominoids to be at about 25 to 30 million years ago. So this very well could be the early, this is so far in the fossil record the earliest hominoid, and the date lines up with the data from the molecular studies for that. Trying to turn pages with a Band-Aid on your thumb is really not fun. So then we get to the next epoch, which is the Miocene. And we're looking at the hominoids of the Miocene. So now, because we're working towards the human ancestral line, which is what we're going to be talking about after the test. And so now that we've had the split from the old world monkeys, now we're just going to look at the hominoid line. So 23 million to 5.3 million years ago is the Miocene. So now we're seeing a warming trend again. So we've had that really cold trend. Now we're going to have the warming trend. And there's a variety of Catarrhine primates of the superfamily Hominoidea. There's quite a variety that exists in Africa, Asia, and Europe during the Miocene. They're predominantly or primarily arboreal. They have ape-like heads, and their bodies are kind of a mix of ape and monkey-like features. So they're, evolving away from the monkey-shaped body to a more ape-like body, and they already have lost their tails. So by the Miocene, we've already got that adaptation where there's no tail anymore. So there's about 30 genera known from the Miocene. Some of the important ones in Africa is Proconsul, which is one of the earliest ones that we discovered. It was found in Kenya. It dates from 22 to 14 million years ago. It was about Cocker Spaniel size primate. And what was happening during the time of Proconsul was sea levels had gone down. From 17 to 18 million years ago, there were lower sea levels that created a land bridge between Africa and Europe. So that those hominoids that had evolved in Europe now had a chance to migrate to Africa and vice versa. So there was some population mixing able to go on. And so we begin to see Miocene hominoids in Europe and Asia during this time period because they're coming over from Africa. And then in Asia, the two main ones that we see are Shivapithecus, which was originally thought to be a human ancestor, but they have since found more complete fossils and determined that it's a hominoid, but it's not a human ancestor. And that's from about 15 million years ago. And then the other one, which I think is really cool, is Gigantopithecus, which is also found in India and Pakistan, as well as China and Vietnam. Gigantopithecus was from 9 million to less than a million years ago. So this is a primate that overlapped with Homo erectus. So there's always that thought in the back of my head, like, wow, maybe Homo erectus had storytelling capabilities and they saw these giant apes and told stories about them, and that evolved into Yeti and Bigfoot. All we know about them is they were very large. We only have, when I talk about, that how important teeth are, Gigantopithecus, we only have teeth and jaw. That's the only part of the fossil we found. There is a picture in your book of the size of the jaw and the dentition compared to a gorilla mandible, much larger than a gorilla mandible. So these were very large apes. Largest primate ever known is Gigantopithecus. And then in Europe, they had about 8 genera of apes between 13 and 8 million years ago. The best known one is Dryopithecus. A lot of these, you can tell where they were found by their names. So you have Puralopithecus catalonicus, which was found in Catalan area of Spain. Oranopithecus macedoniensis was found in Macedonia. The Purolopithecus is thought to be part of a group that gave rise to all great apes and humans, so common ancestor for all great apes and humans. It's a pretty new discovery, so there's not as much known about it. Oranopithecus dates to about 9 to 10 million years ago. It's also been proposed as a possible common ancestor. Again, as they find more fossils, they'll be able to make a better determination of whether or not these are common ancestors. So by the end of the Miocene, we see early members of the human line in Africa with the beginnings of bipedal adaptation. So we have reached the point where we can move away from the non-human primates, so that when we come back after the midterm or the test, we will now be studying the human line from now till the end of the semester. So that's the chapter. There's homework for this chapter. Next week, instead of homework, you'll have the next test. It'll be just like the first test. It's only on chapters 9, 10, 8, 9, 10, 9, 10, and 11. It's only on the chapters on non-human primates. None of it's on the chapters from the previous test. It's going to be the same format, 50 points, less than 50 questions, multiple choice, true, false, matching. And you'll have 3 hours to get it done and a week to choose when to take it. And as always, if you have any questions leading up to when you're going to take the test, always feel free to email me, or if you really need help, email me and we'll set up a Zoom or an on-campus time to get together to help you study. Okay?